Hi, I'm Garrett Graff, the director of the Cyber Initiative at the Aspen Institute, and thank you very much for joining us today. This session is part of a series of briefings that we are preparing on misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, hosted by the Aspen Institute in tandem with our Commission on Information Disorder. We're talking to top experts in the field who can help us make sense of the various facets of the information crisis. They are designed as a resource for our commissioners and the broader public. And we hope you find this series, which we're calling Disinfo Discussions, both useful and informative. In today's episode, I am speaking with Molly McKew, a writer and an expert on information warfare and propaganda. Molly writes greatpower.us and has an extensive history studying influence operations in and around Russia and the Balkans. Molly, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Let me start by asking you a little bit to talk about what you see as the hallmarks of online information operations, and how have you seen that evolve over the last couple of years as you have been studying that problem?
I think, in the broader context of influence operations and where disinformation fits in that landscape, I think this is really the most interesting question, and how, in particular, we tend to separate these things out and how we talk about them now, that disinformation is this whole topic and everything else is kind of over there. But I think the way in which disinformation is sort of, a blip on a screen of broader things going on that we need to pay attention to. I think, particularly when we're talking about foreign adversarial campaigns, that's really the space where I think we need to spend more time looking and why it's so important that we do this work. And I think it's the way in which information has become sort of information campaigns, information operations, however you want to define that, has become sort of an integral piece of campaigns to influence the United States, in particular in these much broader, more existential battles about democracy versus various forms of authoritarianism. For me, this is sort of the big canvas of this discussion and where we need to spend a lot more time in the debates that we're having about this.
And in your mind, why is this tactic so appealing to authoritarian regimes?
I think it's sort of the quick, easy, deniable categories, right? You can do this well without needing a ton of people or a lot of money. Certainly people and money help in these efforts, but you can also do it well without those things. And the ability to have these not directly attributable to you, and even if they are attributable to you, then there's the constant questions of, oh, but did it matter? What did it really affect? How do we measure effectiveness of these campaigns? What are the metrics that we can really use to pick these things apart? Is it really just the problem is us and not the people attacking us? Like all of these bigger discussions that we've been having, I think the landscape in which targeted information operations and disinformation campaigns that fit in that landscape, but the way in which these are being used, and the amount of time we spend, is it this, is it that, is it nothing, is it something? All of this sort of helps explain why it's something that I think our adversaries would like to use. And again, it's easy, it's quick, it's an asymmetric tactic that really levels the playing field between different types of powers. And I don't think we're going to see it go away for that reason.
Mm-hmm. This is a tactic that obviously came to the fore of geopolitical conversations following the 2016 election and the efforts by the Russian Internet Research Agency. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you have seen the West respond over the last couple of years, and how effectively, accurately, thoroughly do you see the West marshaling a response on these issues?
On the response part, not really at all. And I think there's moments of success or moments of hope, with long periods in between where it seems like all of us are much more comfortable talking about this as a problem that targets other people and not our own countries. It's sort of this, even when we're evaluating this or discussing the history of these types of things, there's sort of 2016 onward, and then there's like whatever happened in 1975 or before. But we sort of leave out this entire recent period. If you were going to pick sort of a more recent starting point between 2007, when the Kremlin sort of admits we're becoming more active, watch out everyone, then you have, Estonia, you have the war in Georgia, you have a bunch of stuff happening in the Balkans, then you have sort of Crimea and stuff in Moldova and more things in Ukraine and onward. But in sort of the broader, more recent landscape of these tactics, and in many of these places where I've had the good fortune to work, I think if you put what we saw in 2016 in the United States in that context, there was no surprise about what was happening. And I think good reason for many people to raise early concerns about the types of narratives and activity that we were seeing leading up to 2016. But it seems like we haven't done a good job of looking at that and sort of admitting in a much more clear way, the Kremlin does this, other adversaries are now learning to do this, they will do this way, it will continue, companies have allowed it to happen. I feel like we just, every day we like re-litigate that same sort of 5 bits of a sentence that just need to be accepted to have any real discussion on the what do we do about it part. And we're not really good at sort of getting to the left of the boom on this. I feel like we're still spending a lot of time on the right of the boom, but not looking at the right stuff, if that makes sense.
Let me use that as actually an opportunity to pivot and talk about what do we do about it,
Yep.
which is something that we really want to spend the bulk of our time today talking about anyway. Which is, you have spent a lot of time thinking about what works in countering influence operations online, countering disinformation online. And I wonder, in your mind, let me sort of start by trying to untangle those two things first, which is, what is different about countering just general disinformation online from countering an active information influence operation?
Yeah, I mean, one is a small tool in a broader thing, right? And I think the very specific informational aspect, and that then there's sort of tools to identify, tools to expose, tools to counter. There are things you can do algorithmically to kind of help reduce the reach of those narratives and pieces of content. There's sort of a very specific set of tactics that companies and individuals can take to sort of minimize the reach of an information campaign, which is primarily just leaving it alone and like not giving it any extra oxygen. But on the other hand, so much of it then becomes about, like when you're talking about a broader influence campaign, so much of it becomes about leadership and the absolutely critical role that national leadership and clear, concise leadership plays in sort of seeing these problems, explaining them to the public, developing a real strategy to counter sort of aggressive, hybrid, multi-phase, primarily asymmetric campaigns by adversarial powers. And this is just one component of that. And I think we need to not conflate those things. Countering disinformation does not solve all of these other problems. It is one aspect of the many things we need to be much more in tune with and have a much more aggressive sort of intelligence and law enforcement ability to see into what is happening and figure out what we actually want to do about a lot of it. But there's this piece of leadership that is so specific, particularly in rebuilding the sort of, in Russian terms, the spiritual resources that we as citizens have within this landscape. I think the thing that's so disturbing about modern disinformation and a lot of these influence campaigns that are partially being waged with social media, which reaches directly to us with no filters, is exactly that. These are tools, or can be tools, of state warfare that target individual citizens directly with no elements of national defense that we would normally think of as being engaged, filtering any of that attack on us, if you want to define it that way, right? And that sort of unfettered access of tools of state power reaching citizens of foreign countries directly is very hard to deal with. And I think the importance of rebuilding understanding of values, sort of this idea of social fabric, how we see ourselves as citizens in a nation, how we see the nation in the world, all of that then becomes so critical as a necessary defense mechanism in this much broader discussion. And I think that sometimes we really don't see the true massive deep scope of all that is happening, or choose not to, because it's really disturbing when you actually look at the many parts. And I think a good example of this is like, if you look at, and again, I'm not saying everything is Russia, but like in terms of examples we can look at, if you look at Syria, there's like a very specific piece of discussions about Syria from 2013 onward that is very specific to Kremlin-backed disinformation campaigns, discrediting various actors in the Syrian conflict, discrediting humanitarian organizations that are working to counter Assad, discrediting the various rebel groups that were trying to work against Assad, trying to conflate everyone with terrorists. Huge online disinformation networks built specifically about building perceptions of Syria in the West, in particular. And that is like one aspect of the gazillion other things that the Kremlin has been doing in Syria that, boils down to at times supporting ISIS to ensure that Assad was safe, and then carpet bombing the entire country to drive a civilian refugee crisis toward Europe that helped destabilize the European landscape. Now, was every piece of that planned in like a puppet mastery way? No, but this was the ultimate outcome of what happened. And so I think the one piece is like something we can talk about very concretely. Look at these networks of terrible people that have amplified pro-Assad, pro-Kremlin disinformation. But the fact that it is the sort of tip of the iceberg of all of this other activity that the Kremlin has spent looking at Syria and understanding the different pieces of Syria and how that connects to different influence campaigns they've been running in Europe to sort of change political discourse in Europe. When you look at all of that, it's really, really depressing because it doesn't look very good. And nobody really wants to do that because it's really depressing when you understand the Kremlin was willing to carpet bomb Syria to achieve political objectives in Europe.
And so thinking about how we do a better job of tackling countering disinformation and information influence operations online, what strategies have you seen be successful, either at the government level, at the tech platform level, or at the like individual user level?
So I think there's sort of two things, broadly speaking, that I think governments can do well. I think a great example of it has been in Lithuania, where there's sort of a military-centric unit that kind of monitors the information domain in Lithuania and puts out public product discussing sort of narratives targeting Lithuania and how to understand those. Like, what is the goal of these information campaigns that are targeting Lithuanians and sort of people in the country? They do it in a non-attributed way, so it doesn't become these discussions of X person is a Kremlin agent or this person is whatever. It's like, this is the narrative, this is what it wants to achieve, and this is how you should understand it. They've done this over the course of years in terms of their public-facing product. There's a bunch of non-public-facing stuff they do as well. But the public-facing product has created more awareness in society about the sort of broader landscape of narrative. Media organizations can use it. It has built trust. It is seen as nonpartisan. It is seen as sort of an aspect of a state-level institution that has built trust in society and is trying to work in the space in a sort of trust-based way. And that's been really effective. And it's very few places have even tried to replicate it in the same way, but the way that they do it is, I think, extremely useful because it's not debunking specific bits of disinformation or fact checking or whatever else. It's like the higher level there's this big war of narratives about history, about Lithuania, about NATO, about whatever. And these are what they mean, and this is how you should understand them. And just that, like, the whole psychic discussion of that is really useful for individuals to see, and then you can sort of interpret other pieces of content or media or whatever in that lens as well, and sort of this person saying this sounds a lot like that, maybe this is how I should understand it. So I think that's extremely useful, and you saw bits of this. Sort of CISA at DHS was like trying to emulate pieces of this during the last 2020 election cycle in ways that I thought were really useful. It needs to be consistent and not just focused on elections. I think they need to do this more broadly, specifically on sort of foreign or hostile adversarial narrative. But it's incredibly useful to have some element of government authority talking about this to the public in a consistent way. And everybody can then get mad when it's like their own thing and like, no, it's not the Russians, this is my thing or whatever. But like, it really does matter to have some element of government authority talking about this stuff in a very targeted way. So I think that can really help. I think the other aspect that is important in how governments try to approach this isn't really the media literacy, civics discussion, although those things certainly don't hurt. But it's this broader concept. Like in the US, I would put it in the concept of sort of rebuilding a service-based culture, or really investing a lot of time in understanding concepts of civil defense in a way that we haven't in a really long time. But if we're talking about modern influence campaigns, modern types of warfare that are targeting citizens directly, citizens need to be an aspect of that response, or at least have the opportunity to be an aspect of that response. And I think the US government in particular has been very poor in mobilizing the US public in ways that could be effective to help deter the influence of disinformation online. And I think the best examples I can give you about that are just everything that happened after COVID. And all of these sort of social mobilization tools that we assumed the country had did not exist, even for things like doctors and nurses or people who can give vaccinations. Like, there weren't the databases of things that we assumed that there were. And we rely on the National Guard for pretty much everything. And that should be something that becomes a much broader network of service, of training, of how we reach into society, of how citizens interact with government, how government interacts with citizens in terms of this idea of mobilization around useful skills and training and all sorts of other things. And you see this much more broadly, in particular in the Baltic societies, in Lithuania and Estonia in particular, where there are large reserves that have various specialties, women's reserves, medical reserves, information reserves, cyber reserves. So you have a much broader reach into society in terms of all of this sort of social mobilization and how people understand how they fit in society and what government does for them, which is really lacking in the US, and in ways where we could use it and it would be very useful, not just for the sake of like doing this because of disinformation, but like COVID really showed us how poor our national mobilization mechanisms are in a whole different variety of lanes. And we need to rebuild that. And it would absolutely help in this sense of redefining values and the role of citizens in society in a way I think we really need.
And what about the tech platforms themselves? Do you see them having a what I would describe as a systemic or strategic role in countering disinformation?
Sure, but they won't. And I wish that I could say that differently and that there was a way to sort of stroke this or shape it into a different discussion. But when we're talking about the current tech giants, this current social media giants that have a humongous data advantage over any new entrants into any of these new things for some time to come, they know exactly what they're doing and exactly how the stuff is being used and exactly how effective it is. And they have all the research, and we've seen little pieces of it. And if honestly a report to the Facebook execs saying, hey, our algorithms created 60% more Nazis in Germany didn't make them think, maybe we need to look at this more closely, I don't know what's going to. And every time there's a hearing or anytime there's a thing, oh, it's our first day, we had no idea. Just tell us what you need and we're going to fix it. And it's this totally disingenuous crap. They know exactly what their stuff does. They know what their algorithms do. They know how it is aiding toxic crap online, and you could define that in a whole variety of different ways. They know that that it is not just people making money from stupid QAnon merchandise. This is like that state actors understand how to game algorithms and how to put content in front of people in an effective way. And they're not going to do anything about it because that's how they make money. And there's just no way to salvage that. And I think this challenge of regulation is so complex because these are global platforms and global companies operating in so many places. And legislatures in particular, it's not just they don't have the expertise to do this, they just have no idea. It would be constant reactionary, regulation and not anything that's really setting the structure overall that I think would have a real impact. And so I think that's the challenge, at least with the current set of CEOs. And I just, I wish I had a more constructive recommendation in the space, but I think it's very clear with the current companies and the current leadership, very few things would actually stop them from allowing their platforms to be used the way that they're being used.
Yeah. We talk a lot about disinformation both as a supply side problem and a demand side problem. And we've talked a little bit about solutions on the demand side here. But I wonder, as you look at the global environment, are there ways that we, as a government, as a society, could affect the supply side as well and make this a less attractive or higher cost operation for adversaries to pollute our information ecosystem?
Absolutely. And I think, we get so lost now in the problems, not them, it's us discussions, which is very attractive in a lot of ways. But I don't think it's an accident that 4 years from when we started having, well, almost 5 years now from when we started having these discussions initially about the ways in which Russian disinformation campaigns in particular were targeting American society, we now see it as a domestic problem because the whole point was always to make it a domestic problem. And I think you've had other people on contributing in the series who have talked about sort of the history of all of this. And I think the point that really needs to be made in terms of the Kremlin's tactics, whether it be, Tsarist or Soviet or now, is this piece about amplifying conflict. And in Gerasimov terminology, the permanently operating front within society. And because I really don't think Americans in particular have understood this, it has become very fashionable to believe that the Kremlin amplifies extreme right-wing ideology in the United States because it agrees with it or whatever else, and really not to talk about that other part, which is very leftist. The merger of the two becomes anti-establishment, anti-American, however you want to define it. But it's not about amplifying one set of views. It is about amplifying the conflict between the two, because it is that mobilization of the conflict, a changing behavior and how two things sit against each other, that is the goal of all of this. And I think we really need to understand that better as individuals, as a society. And it really helps to sort of pry apart some of this domestic discussion as well, to understand that, are any of these divisions about how we see race in America or how we see the role of police or any of these other things where there's now intense online conflict, are any of these new? No. And I think we'll all admit that. These are long, ongoing conflicts within US society. But in this period during which foreign adversaries have spent a lot of time thinking about how to use that conflict, using these new tools, using these new platforms, we have seen this boil to a head in the United States. And I think we should understand what that means. And again, not excusing any of our own failings or divisions or weaknesses, but understanding how those are being exploited and used against us and why that matters is absolutely critical. So to your actual question, which was how do we, can we raise the cost on this? We should, and we're not. And it was a different discussion entirely during the Trump administration, where there were a whole series of political issues relating to the Oval Office where this was not going to happen, despite many smaller things happening within the US government about Russia overall that were quite positive. I would hope that, having had two successive administrations that did not really do much about deterring or containing Russia, however you want to define that problem set, and in fact, opening many new avenues for them to act pretty much unchallenged, and incurring few costs beyond some sanctions that didn't do very much. They're important, but not changing the Kremlin's behavior in any way, shape, or form. I really hope that the new administration understands we cannot have another one of these things where we spend 4 years giving the Kremlin a fair shake and hoping we're going to get some different activities out of them when we're not. And it's just delusional to think so. And every administration kind of goes through the cycle, but we can't do it again because we're so advanced in this conflict and the way in which the Kremlin is trying to reach into American society and drive us all crazy. And the way in which we're now ignoring how all of this is happening. There's a very well-established philosophy of deterrence that we used to be quite good at, that no one really talks about and no one's really focused on. Very, sort of diverse and not connected pieces of the US government or military are kind of focused on this problem in different ways. But there needs to be a center of this action within the US government that I think understands sort of three critical things. One, there is in fact a global war between democracies, however you want to define that, and various systems of authoritarian control. Two, those things target us and the English language specifically because it matters so deeply where we are in this and if we do anything or not. And if we sit on our butt some more, it's going to be a different outcome than not. And three, we really just have to be there and actually fight it and stop pretending like it's not happening. And for me, those are just critical things. And I do think in general, President Biden sort of comes from the plane of existence where these are common truths, but the getting action out the other side part is always a challenge. There needs to be a new understanding of, especially for high-level adversaries like Russia and China, who are coordinating together, that are using diverse asymmetric tools, very disparate from their incredibly powerful militaries that we spend a lot of time worrying about. But we need to understand all those other elements of influence and map them better in American society. And to begin, just inform all of the targets of those things about what this is. Like, there's been all these debates about Chinese money in American schools. But nobody ever talked to the schools about that before this becoming like a public media scandal, right? We need to have better outreach to companies, academic institutions, think tanks, individuals about what this influence is and what it means. And we need to have a better toolkit of response for hostile adversarial actions in all of these sort of gray domains, particularly in the information domain, that exact real costs for trying to accelerate conflict in American society.
So this commission is aimed at trying to drive short-term and medium-term actionable policy change,
Yep.
whether that's out of government, whether that's out of the tech platforms, whether that's out of civil society. What would be your advice to the commission? What would be at the top of your list of what those solutions actually look like? You do a really good job setting up the debate and saying, the challenge is getting the answers and the movement out the other end. So what would that movement out the other end look like to you in terms of things you would like to see the government or tech platforms be doing?
Well, on the tech platform side, at the very least, I would say right now there's this extremely reactive volunteers and outside researchers do the research and tell them, hey, here's a foreign, inauthentic behavior thing that's influencing. You should take this down. Oh yeah, we should take that. Like, okay, that's great. But they do that themselves internally and then do nothing with all of that research. So number one, stop embedding your employees with foreign political parties and governments who are trying to use these tools of sort of anti-democratic suppression within their own societies. Just stop embedding your own employees in those. That would be great. Two, identifies those campaigns publicly. Like when you see there is coordinated inauthentic action in an election in Kenya, say it out loud. Like, stop letting your platform be used for this stuff. Especially in countries where Facebook, for example, has a vastly disproportionate reach as an alternative media tool because the media environment is sort of controlled by money and very restrictive. So just things like that, even not doing a thing to change their algorithms or how they make money or anything else, just being more genuine in how they are exposing foreign, inauthentic, coordinated behavior or political inauthentic coordinated behavior on their platforms would be a huge step forward in exposing how all of these tools are targeting all of us. It's not just Americans. It's not just, it's every country. Almost every political party now believes they need these tools to win elections because everybody else is using them, so they have to do it too.
And Facebook does put out their monthly, they call it, their coordinated inauthentic behavior reports. But you're talking about something that sounds more aggressive and higher profile than that.
Yeah, because what they're doing is still this very reactive, clunky, somebody flagged this for us, so here it is on a piece of paper. They do that monitoring themselves. Like, the idea that they have no idea what's happening on their own platforms, whether it be Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or whatever else, is just bullshit. They have a ton of people staring at this stuff and they understand what's happening. And they can do more about it than they are currently doing. I think particularly in the political domain, when it is political campaigns or in an electoral context, there are a number of companies and services offering, particularly in places that remain very opaque to many of us African nations and the elections they are conducting, for example, that are offering these types of services where it's a humongous disproportionate advantage if you are the well-funded ruling party versus a bunch of, oppositional challengers in some of these environments, where the kind of influence that's being waged is totally non-transparent to everyone who's on the receiving end. And in all the ways that all of the other people you've had contribute to this have discussed, sort of using people who look like you to talk to you as opposed to, it's a political influencer or whatever, all of these sort of inauthentic accounts, I think where there's really then this layer of the challenge is the way the platforms work with the companies offering those services to ruling parties in democratic systems that want to maintain control. It was just as creepy that Facebook had employees sitting in Donald Trump's campaign in 2016 as it is when there are Facebook employees sitting in campaigns in Africa. They should not have a role in helping campaigns target information when it is these types of divisive ads and not just like informing people about their policies. They know exactly what they're doing. They're making a ton of money off of offering these sort of high-end VIP services, and they shouldn't be allowed to. It's very creepy that they do it. So I think just removing that as an advantage for certain actors would be something that could be done that would be of huge benefit, absent them revealing any information about what's happening on their platforms in ways that they currently do not. There's obviously things that could be done algorithmically to change how information moves, to disincentivize, like when there's like a rage response to content, as opposed to different types of amplification. There's lots of things that could be done to change how content trends, amplifies, how it reaches new people, how it recommends to you to follow excuse me, more extreme types of content as opposed to other types of content. Like, is your algorithm making people into Nazis or not? Seems like a pretty interesting question to ask. So I think there's things that can be recommended on that side, where at the very least you can create a burden for the companies of proving they are looking at these things and have to meet certain, reporting requirements at the very least. Because I think one of the things that's most interesting in the technology companies over the last 3 or 4 years has been a shift from these really closed bubbles of sort of happy culture benefits, we're superior to others mindset. You see more dissent within the employee cultures. You see the leak of more information in a way that never used to happen from Facebook in particular. There's a lot more stuff being leaked, a lot more employees and former employees talking to reporters about things that they find sort of troubling or objectionable. And all of that, I think, can help build pressure within these companies to move toward reform. So the more sort of pressure you put on leadership the leadership of these companies to have to look at these issues, to have to report on these issues in ways that internally employees see, oh, they really have no interest in dealing with this. And I know that they have a lot of information on this that they're not doing anything with. All of that kind of helps create more of a culture of a push for transparency that I think is sort of happenstance right now. But I don't know that it's ever going to be fixed because the amount of money at stake is obscene, and it's all imaginary money that was conjured from the air. So there's like no cost to continuing to conjure this money from the air. So I feel like there's a lot of problems on the side, but those are some concrete things that can be recommended and attempted to be done. On the sort of government side, again, I'm going to focus on this leadership level in terms of what the White House can do right now. I think trying to shoot past the mess landscape of information and reach down into society and help rebuild concepts of shared culture, shared values. I know all of these have now become like hot button terms that everybody's trying to press all the time, but kind of get around the dumb debates and get into basic concepts again of sort of the identity of citizens of the nation and what it means to be a citizen of this country in non-polarizing ways. All of that can really help. And I think this idea of rebuilding some sort of surface-based culture is really important. I think the problem we have in that whole space of boy leadership would really help is we have this Congress. And right now, the incentive of how people get elected is you get money and you get free money and free fame from being an extremist, crazy jerk most of the time. And it's more true on the right than on the left, but it is true of all political factions right now that the Instagram Congress is the Congress that is not going to will not incentivize the election of people who want to do the work. I don't care what you believe. We need people in those jobs who actually want to do the work of governing, which is quite complex and requires a lot of time. And if you're on Instagram all the time, like broadcasting from your kitchen about whatever your liberty thing is, you're not actually doing the work of being in Congress. So we need to figure out a way to incentivize the election of people who are not crazy to the Congress again. And absent that, I don't know how we get the work done that we need to get done in this country. Again, and it's just like, again, I wish I had a better answer for that. I know there's much smarter people working on this question of how you get extremists out of Congress and incentivize the election of people who actually want to compromise and do lawmaking again. I think a piece of it really does lie in solving this issue with primaries and having more open primary structures and increasing competition, and then sort of disincentivizing the free money and the free fame from being crazy. But I know there's people much smarter than me on these issues. So I think right now the hack on the incentivization of the stupid in the middle is really clear leadership from the top, which I think Americans want and are listening for and really want to see, regardless of what their political views are in this country. Most Americans do not want craziness to be dominating their everyday lives and discussions. And then I think there's things that the companies can do, and that all of the outside researchers and commentators and whatever who are looking at the companies and what they do can do. But I think that third space is also political consultants, PR people, big corporations that spend a lot of money on PR. There needs to be a common set of rules and agreements about how we use the online information space that people can sign on to or not, and then we know who they are and what they think. But this idea that the creation of alternative false realities online is going to be a way that companies, political factions, interest groups, good or bad, decide that that's how they're influencing us by eroding our cognition and our ability to see reality for what it is, really has to stop. And so I think there is space for creating a set of rules and agreements for people who choose to participate in them, like the energy saver seal of approval or whatever. But we need that. We need to start setting parameters for what that looks like. Because I don't like it when a Democrat does it. I don't like it when a Republican does it. I don't like it when Amazon is creating fake I'm an Amazon employee accounts and it's so great to work in our warehouses. I don't like any of this stuff. And I think you can see the power in why people do this. But I think the more you see Amazons doing it, the more you understand why Russia and China and Iran are going to keep doing it. So we need to find ways to disincentivize this behavior in actors who can choose not to participate in it, which then I think forces a raising of standards on the platforms. Because the everybody does it motif is going to be the laziest way they get away with not having to do anything about any of it.
Molly, thanks so much for joining us today on Disinfo Discussions.
I'm happy to do it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for pointing your way towards possible solutions to this monumental and very complex problem.
I hope they help. I know it's not a simple, nobody has the simple four item to-do list that's going to get us out of this mess.